All right, welcome back. Today we are on letter 52 on choosing our teachers. So let's jump right into this here. He says, what is this force, Lucilius, that drags us in one direction when we're aiming in another, arguing us on to the exact place from which we long to withdraw? What is it that wrestles with our spirit and does not allow us to desire anything once for all? We veer from plan to plan. None of our wishes is free. None is unqualified. None is lasting. So again, he's asking here, what's stopping us from doing the things that we want to do and taking us to a place that we don't want to go? What's happening here? But it is the fool, you say, who is inconsistent. Nothing suits him for long. But how or when can we tear ourselves away from this folly? No man by himself has sufficient strength to rise above it. He needs a helping hand and someone to extricate him. So he's saying, a foolish person is not constant. They're always going all over the place. But how can we actually do this? Like, we can't do this on our own. In verse 3, it says, Epicurus remarks that certain men have worked their way to the truth without anyone's assistance, carving out their own passage. And he gives special praise to these, for their impulse has come from within, and they have forged to the front by themselves. Again, he says, there are others who need outside help, who will not proceed unless someone leads the way, but who will follow faithfully. Of these, he says, Metrodus was one. This type of man is also excellent, but belongs to the second grade. We ourselves are not of that first class either. We shall be well treated if we are admitted into the second. Nor need you despise a man who can gain salvation only with the assistance of another. The will to be saved means a great deal too. So he's saying that Epicurus actually praised some people who he said didn't need help. They figured it out on their own. They had this impulse from within. Okay. And he says there's other people who do need the outside help. Okay. And won't proceed until someone leads the way. And he said Metrodus was one of them. Okay. And, but he belongs to the second grade. So he's the kind of person that needed the help. But he says, we're not of the first class either. Okay. We're not the people that can do it without any kind of help, but we'll be well treated if we can be part of the second, okay, who's actually made it. And he says, you don't need to despise a man who can gain salvation with the assistance of another, okay? The will to be saved, like just wanting to be saved, that means a great deal, just wanting to change your condition. In verse 4, he says, you will find still another class of man, and a class not to be despised, who can be forced and driven into righteousness, who do not need a guide as much as they require someone to encourage and as if it were, to force them along. This is the third variety, and if you ask me for a man of this pattern also, Epicurus tells us that Hermachius was such, and of the last two named classes, he is more ready to congratulate the one, but he feels more respect for the other. For although both reach the same goal, it is greater credit to have brought about the same result with the more difficult material upon which to work. So what he's saying is, like, there's a third group of people, right? There's people that just get it and just automatically do this without a teacher. There's a group of people who get there with the help of another, and then there's a group of people, but they're the people who want to get help. And there's another third group of people who are forced into it, who don't want help, and don't want to become wise, but they are forced into it, right? That they're driven to it, all right? And he's saying that actually the one that Epicurus has the most respect for is that third group, right? Because it's the more difficult task. It's the more difficult material to work with. He says in verse 5, suppose that two buildings have been erected, unlike as to their foundations, but equal in height and grandeur. One is built on faultless ground, and the process of erection goes right ahead. In the other case, the foundations have exhausted the building materials, for they have been sunk into soft and shifting ground, and much labor has been wasted in reaching the solid rock. As one looks at both of them, one sees clearly what progress the former has made, but the larger and more difficult part of the latter is hidden. So he's saying, look, if you had two buildings you constructed, and one of them, it was good ground, it had a good foundation, and you built that building, and then the other one, it had a bad foundation, so it took a lot to actually even just get the foundation, you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. You wouldn't know that one of them, actually, it took a lot more work. So he says in verse 6, so with men's dispositions, some are pliable and easy to manage, but others have to be laboriously wrought out by hand, so to speak, and are wholly employed in the making of their own foundations. I should accordingly deem more fortunate the man who has never had any trouble with himself, but the other, I feel, has deserved better of himself, who has won a victory over the meanness of his own nature and has not gently led himself, but has wrestled his way to wisdom. So he's saying here is the same with men, right, as these buildings, okay? So some guys, it's easy for them to manage. They're it's easy to help them and to change them. But others, it's just a lot. It's a lot of work, right? To get them to actually change, okay? To actually get them on the right path. So he's saying that I would say that it's more fortunate for a man who's never had any trouble with himself, but the person that does has deserved better of himself, who's won a victory over the meanness of his own nature. So if you were not inclined to that, then it's actually better. Like it's more of a victory to have done that. But if you've wrestled your ways to wisdom, right? So maybe you can relate to that. I certainly can. I have trouble getting myself to do the right thing, but then it's a battle. You may be sure that this refractory nature, which demands much toil, has been implanted in us. There are obstacles in our path, so let us fight and call to our assistance some helpers. Whom, you say, shall I call upon? Shall it be this man or that? There's another choice also open to you. You may go to the ancients, for they have the time to help you. You can get assistance not only from the living, but from those of the past. So he's saying, okay, well, where can I get help? Right? And he's saying, should you go to this man or not, or that? And he's saying, actually, you can go to the ancients, to the people who have lived in the past. So he says in verse 8, let us choose, however, from among the living, not men who pour forth their words with the greatest glibness, turning out commonplaces and holding, as it were, their own little private exhibitions. Not these, I say, but men who teach us by their lives, men who tell us what we ought to do and then prove it by practice, who show us what we should avoid and then are never caught doing that which they have ordered us to avoid. Choose as a guide one whom you will admire more when you see him act than when you hear him speak. So he's saying, like, if you do choose men among the living, not just people who say great things, but look at their actions. Look at the men who practice what they preach, who actually do what they say and they're telling you to do. In verse 9, he says, of course, I would not prevent you from listening also to those philosophers who are wont to hold public meetings and discussions, provided they appear before the people for the express purpose of improving themselves and others, and do not practice their profession for the sake of self-seeking. For what is baser than philosophy courting applause? Does the sick man praise the surgeon while he is operating? So he's saying, okay, look, if you want to listen to these philosophers that are talking in the crowds, that's fine, so long as they're not doing it for their own self, right? Because it'd be ridiculous if a sick man was praising a surgeon while he was operating, for applaud. Like, philosophy is not for applaud. That's not the point of it. In verse 10, he says, in silence and with reverent awe submit to the cure. Even though you cry applause, I shall listen to your cries as if you were groaning when your sores were touched. Do you wish to bear witness that you are attentive, that you are stirred by the grandeur of the subject? You may do this at the proper time. I shall, of course, allow you to pass judgment and cast a vote as to the better course. Pythagoras made his pupils keep silence for 5 years. Do you think that they had the right on that account to break out immediately into applause? So he's saying, look, I'm not saying that you can't applause, that you can't be happy about philosophy. Just hold off. Like, let's wait. Let's wait until the right time, until you've actually applied this stuff. Don't just applaud what I'm saying and then you're not doing it. Like, let's actually execute on this, and then we can talk. Okay, then you can be happy about all this. All right. It says in verse 11, how mad is he who leaves the lecture room in a happy frame of mind simply because of the applause from the ignorant? Why do you take pleasure in being praised by men whom you yourself cannot praise? Fabanius used to give popular talks, but his audience listened with self-control. Occasionally, a loud shout of praise would burst forth, but it was prompted by the greatness of his subject and not by the sound of oratory that slipped forth pleasantly and softly. So he's saying, look, here's the thing, right? It's crazy if you were to go and speak to a crowd and you were so happy because you got this applause from ignorant people. You should take pleasure in being praised by people who you would actually praise, right? And he says this one guy, Fabinius, he used to give these popular talks, and sometimes, in the audience listened with self-control, but sometimes there'd be a shout of praise, but it wasn't because he spoke so well. It was because someone was excited about the subject he was talking about. In verse 12, he says, there should be a difference between the applause of the theater and the applause of the school. And there's a certain decency even in bestowing praise. If you mark them carefully, all acts are always significant, and you can gauge character by even the most trifling signs. The lecherous man is revealed by his gait, by a movement of the hand, sometimes by a single answer, by his touching his head with a finger, by the shifting of an eye. The scamp is shown up by his laugh, the madman by his face and general appearance. These qualities become known by certain marks, but you can tell the character of every man when you see how he gives and receives praise. So he's saying here that, look, there should be a difference between the applause in a theater and that of a school. Okay. And there's decency in bestowing that praise. All right. And he's saying that, look, you can figure out people by in their character by looking at them and watching them. Right. And really, if you really want to know the character of a man, look and see how he gives and receives praise. How does he give people praise? How does he receive praise? That's what to look at. In verse 13, he says, the philosopher's audience from this corner and that stretch forth admiring hands, and sometimes the adoring crowd almost hang over the lecturer's head. But if you really understand that it is not praise, it is merely applause. These outcries should be left for the arts which aim to please the crowd. Let philosophy be worshipped in silence. So he's saying that, look, it's not the same as theater. Okay, the point is not to excite people and to get people riled up and for pleasure. Okay, it's to teach. So it should be it's just an applause. It's not this, it's not this, it's not this craziness, this excited, because I'm listening to this famous person. It's philosophy should be worshipped in silence. Like you should get the sense of the thing that this is wise, right? In verse 14, he says, young men indeed must sometimes have free play to follow their impulses, but it should only be at times when they act from impulse and when they cannot force themselves to be silent. Such praise as that gives a certain kind of encouragement to the hearers themselves and acts as a spur to the youthful mind. But let them be roused to the matter and not to the style. Otherwise, eloquence does them harm, making them enamored of itself and not of the subject. So he's saying, look, there are times where, you're just going to feel like you have to give this praise, like you don't want to be silent. And that's fine if they're acting out of impulse, if it's just like it's something that you can't control. All right. And that kind of praise does actually benefit. Okay. Because it spurs people on. Right. But you should be roused by the matter, the actual thing that's being talked about, not the style of it. Okay. Otherwise, that eloquence, it actually does harm. Okay. You don't want to be enamored by the way that a person's talking about, what they're talking about. What is the subject? I shall postpone this topic for the present. It demands a long and special investigation to show how the public should be addressed, what indulgences should be allowed to a speaker on a public occasion, and what should be allowed to the crowd itself in the presence of the speaker. There can be no doubt that philosophy has suffered a loss now that she has exposed her charms for sale, but she can still be viewed in her sanctuary if her exhibitor is a priest and not a peddler. Farewell. So he's saying here, look, there's a lot to talk about this, about how you should talk in front of a crowd, how the crowd should behave and whatnot. And he said that, philosophy has suffered a loss, okay, because it's become more widespread. And so people are selling philosophy. They're selling their, the way that they're talking, it's become this thing instead of what it was supposed to be. But it's okay. You can still find the purity of it. If the exhibitor, the person giving it, is a priest, is acting like a priest giving a sermon rather than a peddler trying to sell something. I'll see you tomorrow.